Blackman of the Nile and his family, part 15. The maps of the following page by Eratosthenes and Herodotus leave no doubt that the indigenous Africans they were relating to were those of North and East Africa, not to slaves from Nubia in the Egyptian army, which is the usual claim by the so-called white liberal and orthodox authorities on Africa and African peoples over the last 200 or more years. The Africans, or Ethiopians, as the earliest Greeks and Romans called them, were from North and East Alkebulan, as elsewhere, but this was not known by either of these two men when they drew their maps of the continent they call Africa. The man who made such an impact on the European and European American world with respect to his physical identification of the North and East Africans, Herodotus, an Ionian of the Egyptian colony by birth, Greek by citizenship, at the age of 40 or 47, went to Egypt from Greece in the year 457 or 450 BCE to receive his education, the same as all of the other Greeks of wealth before him and many others after him. He lived among the Africans, Ethiopian blacks or Negro, priests of the Osirica mystery system, the intellectuals of Egyptian, Nubian, Ethiopian, Merotite, and other Nile Valley and Great Lakes societies, learning and collecting curious information on all that Egypt could offer, which he recorded scripturously, much of the same which he co-signed to the second book of the masterpiece he named Euterpe. In it, he stated that which was corroborated in the African-European high priest Manetho, who served under Ptolemy I, the former general Sotar of Alexander II. Unfortunately, Herodotus is still called the father of history, even though his works are loaded with the quoted data of indigenous African historians of the Nile and the Great Lakes region of Alkebulan. The said information came from the very source Manetho used approximately 170 years after Herodotus wrote his book on the Nile River Valley, Egypt particularly, 450 through 280 BCE. Julius Africanus, Eusebius, and Josephus, all of them ancient historians of great distinction, testified to the greatness of Manetho's works and copied most of his data. It should be noted that Eratosthenes and Herodotus, as other Europeans of their era, believed that the Sahara was a major body of water. They had no conception of Africa south of the Sahara, and to this general belief, though somewhat changed, still carries the same old stereotype connotations. Yet the Greeks had turned the horn of East Africa and entered the Indus River. Earlier, Greek and Roman students had done but claimed authorship. Much of the information of all them used are still to be seen on the various monuments, tombs, temples, and walls, including stolen works taken from the archives of the Grand Lodge of Luxor and placed in the museum and private collections throughout Europe, the United States of America, Great Britain, and other places. The consent of the legitimate African descendants, the so-called Negroes in African south of the Sahara, this being another reason why said Africans had to be removed from the history of North and East Africa. 430 BCE, Herodotus, the Ionian of Greek citizenship, arrived in Elephantine in Upper Egypt. He detailed this journey in his book Euterpe, as translated into English by Aubrey de Selincourt, Penguin Books, 1954. Between 400 to 300 BCE, a Greek named Euthymenes sailed to West Africa. Some historians claim that he became the first European to discover or to reach the Senegal River, which he called Fermetes. This is possible, his reaching, not discovered, since only other Europeans on record before the Christian era to arrive in West Africa were two Romans, Septimus Flaccus and Julius Maternus, in 50 and 25 or 30 BCE respectively, but they wrote of the Niger River, not the Senegal River. 345 BCE, the Carthaginians, also called Carthaginians, established an embassy in Rome. Many Western historians claim that it was Fort Veb, which is located a few miles from Rome. They based their contention upon the fact that the Etruscans, friends of the Carthaginians, were already expelled from Rome in approximately 510 BCE, or 165 years before the establishment of the embassy. 332 BCE, Alexander II of Macedonia entered Egypt under military power. This conquest initiated the European Caucasus control, or sphere of influence, in the eastern limits of North Africa for the first time in world history. Aristotle, the so-called Greek philosopher, and many of his fellow cohorts shortly thereafter sacked the archives of Egypt, especially that of the Grand Lodge of Luxor, Thebes. They stole what they understood and burned much of what they did not understand or decipher from the insight they had received from other Greeks and Romans who studied the African mysteries of Egypt and other nations of the Nile Valley before their arrival. 323 BCE, Alexander II died in Egypt. His vast conquered empire was divided among his top generals, all of whom refused to recognize the authority of King Philip III, Alexander's brother in Macedonia. 306 BCE, General Sotar, Alexander's best general, the person Alexander assigned the post of governor of Egypt, declared himself Sotar I, Pharaoh of all Egypt, which he later changed to Ptolemy I, Pharaoh of all Egypt. He too was from Macedonia, but of Greek parentage. He brought the first Europeans in the history of the world to sit on the throne of the Star of the Nile, Egypt. All of the other foreign conquerors until Macedonians and Greeks were from Asia, except fellow Africans that conquered the Africans of Egypt. Under the reign of Ptolemy I, the African-European high priest Manetho became the first historian to codify Egyptian royal history based on dynastic classification. He also completed a compilation of Egypt's history of antiquity and divided it into the first 30 of the 34 royal dynasties shown on pages 158, 159 of this chronology of the dynasties. His works have been translated by much noted historians as Josephus, Leo Africanus, and Eusebius. The latter brought forward the most important translations of Manetho's great works to date. At this juncture, it must be noted that Leo Africanus was an indigenous African, a so-called Negro. He was renamed by his godfather, Pope Leo of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, following his capture, enslavement, and conversion to Christianity. Josephus, on the other hand, was a Hebrew. Here it is seen once more that there is quite a lot to a name. Volumes upon volumes of African sons and daughters' teachings have been called Greek philosophy because of a name or names being changed from the original African works to Greeks and Latin personalities. The African names removed and European names substituted for them. In the case of Aristotle, who did not write a single word in philosophy until he allegedly wrote thousands of books in Egypt, his name appears on African works that preceded his own birth by thousands of years. This practice reached its zenith when Alexander II died and General Sotar set Aristotle loose to ravage the royal library in Alexandria, which was originally an extension branch of the library of the Grand Lodge of Luxor. The majority of the indigenous African works therein were given Aristotle's and other Greek titles and or names, most of them having been written hundreds, some even thousands of years before the birth of Homer, the first known literate Greek. Many of such works are today part of what is still called Greek philosophy, Western history, and great works of Western civilization. However, the Black cultural revolution is forcing much of these truths to be forefront daily. Thus, the old age maxim that the truth shall set you free now lives to hunt those who have been parroting it from the pulpit in synagogues, churches, and mosques. Why? Because of the truth and Black confrontation, which includes the purging of white racism and Semitic religious bigotry inserted in African history and high culture by European and European American educators. 280 BCE, the Meroitic script of Egypt was introduced. It was an indigenous form of communication in hieroglyph through written words and pictorial definitions that were similar to Egyptian and other Nile Valley peoples' demonic script. Very little of this writing is understood or decoded to date. 260 BCE, the indigenous Africans of Carthaginians were defeated in the Battle of Male. 256 BCE, the Carthaginians were defeated at the Battle of Agnomus. 200 BCE, Polybius, a Greek historian and colonial explorer, visited the same ports established by Admiral Hanno many hundreds of years before on the coast of West Africa. In his book Travelodge, he described 7 western African rivers, such as the Gambia, which he called Bambotas. Note that the present Mande Africans, the so-called Mandingos of the Gambia, name for the crocodile is still bamboo, which gave rise to the basis of the name used by Polybius. 190 BCE, another Greek, Eudocius of Cyzicus, sailed down the east coast of Alkebulan after leaving Arabia. He sailed around the Cape of Monomotapa, before that Cabo de Tormentos or Cape of Storms, by the Portuguese with African navigators and sailors, stopping at Angola and the Empire of Zaire, and continued up the Ethiopian seacoast of West Alkebulan until he turned easterly on through the Pillar of Hercules along the Mediterranean Sea to his native Greece. 50 BCE, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, captured Egypt for the Caesar, Emperor of Rome. This is quite a lot of confusion as to whether this date should be 47 or 30 BCE. He, through his Caesar, forced Queen Cleopatra VIII to surrender Egypt and abdicate her throne. Egypt was made a province of the Roman Empire following the publication of a decree that effect issued by Julius Caesar, the Holy Emperor of Rome and colonial North Africa. 47 BCE, Julius Caesar reinstated Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy XIII, as queen of all Egypt. All of the Ptolemies, except Ptolemy I, the former general Sotar from Macedonia, were from similar African-European parentage. 30 BCE, a Roman, Suetonius Flaccus, crossed the Sahara to reach the kingdom of Niger, West Africa, around the regions of Lake Chad. The report he gave upon his return to his native Rome indicates that he actually saw ancient Ghana. Western historians falsely assign Ghana an origin of approximately 300 AD in their attempt to keep all of the African nations south of the Sahara to a history without pre-Christian origin. Flaccus followed Paulinus, another Roman, who visited the northernmost reach of the Niger River in approximately 50 BCE. 0 BCE, Roman rule continued in North Africa, Egypt in particular, during the Egyptian Jews' proclamation of the birth of Jesus Christ. 1 CE, which introduced the Christian era, or the year 1 of the present calendar used officially by the United States of America. Some historians relate year 1 to the birth of Christ, others to the death of Jesus Christ. This chapter here was organized with the objective of showing a picture story of the various aspects of African art, forms, and inscriptions used in architecture, all of which one calls primitive today in the Western world. Another aspect is the presentation of many examples of African peoples of the entire Nile Valley, who are designated Caucasians, Negroids, Hamites, Semites, Bantus, Negroid, Bushmans, Hottentot, Pygmies, etc., by certain liberal and orthodox Africanist authorities on Africa, but with the expertise of comparative objectivity in order to show the racist basis behind these classifications. One will readily notice that the characteristics which allegedly distinguish one race from another are to be found in abundance in all other racial groups. For example, the ancient indigenous Africans of Timeri have been for the past 100 to 200 years labeled Caucasoid and Semitic by European and European American Orthodox historians and other educators. Ethiopians, on the other hand, are labeled Hamitic, whereas the Africans next door to Zaire or the Congo are called Bantu, Pygmy, Forest Negroes, etc. Strange as it may seem, the Africans located between the Egyptians and the Ethiopians are called Nubian Negroes. But the facial expressions in many of their pictures and photographs of these Africans, that special something which is supposed to make one Hamitic, Semitic, or Caucasoid, is equally as strong among the indigenous Africans who allegedly live remotely from each other, the so-called Africans of the South Sahara, Negroids, Negroes, and or Bantus. On page 291, Egyptians of royal lineage are compared with their fellow African peers of Nubia in the north against their equal in the kingdom of Monomotapa. At the southern end of Kakubalan, this was purposefully arranged in order to see that this primitiveness of the indigenous Africans southerners to those of the north. However, the northerners are not generally shown in the same manner as the type of picture selected in this volume. Only those who are descendants of the invaders of Europe and Asia are generally shown by Western historians and other educators. The purpose of this unusual arrangement of the pictures is to give the impressions of the northerners, Egyptians, Numidians, Libyans, Nubians, Carthaginians, Mauritanians, and Southerners were very much alike in their physical appearance. On the other hand, the manner in which they are shown by Western Africanist historians is to give the impressions that the Northerners never passed through the same stages of development as the Southerners of Zimbabwe and Banyoro did, equally of their fellow Africans of Kush and Punt. These factors are also seen in the presentation of the different types of structures built by each group under different natural conditions. One will also notice that the homes which the Southerners are associated with are always called huts or mud hovels, yet they are also developed the type of major structures seen in Zimbabwe's Holy of Holies on page 287. There could be no doubt that this type of structure is equal in engineering and architect greatness as the pyramid structures of Timeri and Ta-Nehisi. Also, the city-state of Carthage, shown on page 311. It is readily seen that the indigenous African high cultures branched out from a central point along the Great Lakes, which they built their first pyramids. From this base outwards, the pyramids, just as the temples and other structures shown in Zimbabwe metropolis on page 289 of this volume, increased in size, quality, and quantity. They also show signs of the Africans' progressive development as they traveled in a northerly direction along the Nile Valley from Uganda to Egypt, or southerly along the Great Lakes and the rivers that connect them from Uganda to Monomotapa. The only mark of separation or distinction between the indigenous Africans traveling north to Timeri and those traveling south to Monomotapa is that the northerners have been able to maintain much more successful armies against their natural enemies. Therefore, they had much more leisure for making their high culture perfect. As such, the northerners, were able to force some of their fellow indigenous Africans to the South to servitude in various periods that amounted to a sort of brain drain, yet most of the northern craftsmen's natural resources and manufactured goods came from the South, from as far south as Punt, where today's Kenya, Somali Republic, and French colonial Somaliland are located. The Southerners' growth was, therefore, stymied, but they developed the necessary science, mathematics, engineering, architecture, religion, philosophy, and other disciplines which produced the great Holy of Holies of Zimbabwe, which is cone-shaped tower and artistic excellence. The great Zimbabwe's art and sculpture in some degrees exceeded that of Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, and all other African nations. More commonly known to the average Westerner, is not listed as one of the wonders of the world. Why? Because those who render such kosher seal of approval did not in the past and do not now consider this African high culture of antiquity the development of the genius of the African people they still consider less than human. Thus they can only compromise that it was built by Africans who are dead, but at first they attribute it to shipwrecked Greeks, followed by marooned Chinese mariners and early Caucasian settlers of prehistoric Africa. Everywhere along the 4,100 miles long Nile Valley River, the indigenous African of antiquity, Negro, Pygmy, Black, or Bantu, built pyramids which remind mankind today of the common heritage of the indigenous African population that preceded them. As one travels from the same starting point, the Great Lakes to the south, similar types of reminders exist in the high cultures and religions of these Africans. The truth was much more obvious even up to the arrival of the first so-called European and European American Christian missionaries and their Asian Muslims counterparts that preceded them in the destruction of most of the rich heritage that was once a part of the great and glorious Alkebulan. Why is it that Professor Jeffrey's modern man cannot see the obvious parallels all of Alkebulan's high cultures? For the same reason that it took Life and Look magazines, along with hundreds of other American publications of similar projection, so many generations of continued existence to publish a few weeks of major articles on the contribution of African Americans in and to the United States of America. For the same reason, it was not told nationally and internationally that many indigenous Africans, like their European counterparts, came to the so-called New World as explorers, such as Pietro Alonso Nino of the Santa Maria. When the first Europeans arrived, not discovered in the Caribbean, which they misnamed West Indies, and willfully and maliciously called people Indians, the Africans' role in the Americas was equal in time, 492 CE, to that of the Europeans before them. It is equally the same reason that Francesco Bawatu, the founder of the city of Brooklyn, a borough of New York City, was not publicized. Henry Point DuSable, the founder of the city of Chicago, Illinois, both have been kept secret from America's school's children, there being no difference in the fact that Phoebe Francis, or Francis, daughter of the original proprietor of Francisca's Tavern of Lower Manhattan, New York City, New York, Samuel Francis, a black man from the Caribbean who saved the father of the United States of America, George Washington, from being poisoned by Thomas Hickey. Washington's most trusted bodyguard, an agent of the British Army, and countless other historical feats performed by other Africans who were still slaves to the European Americans and Europeans in the British, French, and Spanish colonies that later became the United States of America. Everyone knows, or should know, that this is politely titled self-centered egotism and friends. To the less sophisticated, it is the plain old religious bigotry and white racism. This is the reason Africans with thin nose, thick lips, and straight hair suddenly, for the past 100 years, and more so for the last 50 years, have been made Caucasoid, Hamites, Semites, Nilots, Bushmen, Hottentots, and a host of other forms of special racial stereotypes, characters to be preserved in the minds of the modern man racist vocabulary. Yet at one time when the Tigris and the Euphrates valleys were still claimed as the original home, Garden of Eden of mankind, all of the Africans and their descendants, regardless of the shape of their nose, texture of hair, size of lips, and color of skin, and whatever else, were considered the same, Negroes and or niggers. At that period in history, Europeans and European Americans had no trouble in accepting Herodotus' description of the Africans, nor did they condemn others who stated that the indigenous Egyptians were like any other Africans one could find in the east, west, south, or central Alkebulan. One must be reminded that thick lips, woolly hair, burnt skin, and broad nose were attributed to the Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians by Herodotus and other Greek and Romans before and after him. Strange as it may seem, what had been established in history for over 2,000 years to be Egyptian physical characteristics suddenly disappeared in the teachings of European and European American educators of the various disciplines having to do with mankind and race in the late 19th century. Man, the habitually egotistical teacher, has taught himself certain basic philosophy concepts beyond his own physical power and capabilities. That is because he is a dreamer who looks for a solution beyond the reality of his everyday being. One such teaching that came down to modern man, Professor Jeffries and other Caucasian man, the great white race, from the teachings of the ancient African philosophers of the Nile valleys, Great Lakes regions, southern and western Alkebulan through their students, Hebrews, Christians, Judeo-Christians, and Muslims, is the truth shall set you free. But the same truth may not set you, white man, free after you have already enslaved your African fellow human being who found out that his ancient African brothers coined the phrases, man, know thyself, and also eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But we will not die until tomorrow, yet tomorrow may never come in time. It will come at time. Time, in this sense, being the unmeasurable distance for the African, African American, African Caribbean, and all other peoples who have claimed African heritage. Yet more specifically, those who have had to suffer the humiliation of the slave trade, stud farm, cotton farm, and other forms of plantation life, raped by slave masters, genocide, and worst of all, cultural degradation of being told you people had no history. The following examples, just a drop in the bucket, so to speak, of the contributions made by the indigenous African peoples to world civilization are basic to the original peep man took into the elementary concepts of life by the universe around. Yet it is from these original concepts and precepts that the Africans developed their civilizations of the entire world, civilizing, not in its typical perverted usage by so-called modern man, but in the same sense of the introduction of Alkebulan's high culture to Asians and Europeans who had other developments which were quite similar. These works are from the genius of the ancestors of people who are rejected from human society because of their thick lips, woolly hair, broad nose, and burnt skin, people who are called Negroes, Bantus, Negroids, Hottentots, Nilots, Africans south of the Sahara, niggers, fortress Negroes, crime in the street, primitive savages, cannibals, heathens, etc., only to mention a few of the degrading names reserved for them.